The school hallways were quiet, the faint hum of students chattering in classrooms barely breaking the silence. But inside the dimly lit girls' bathroom, a storm was brewing. Emma stood frozen in front of the mirror, her hands gripping the edge of the sink so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breathing uneven. She had seen something she was never supposed to see, something that made her stomach twist with fear. A creak from behind made her jolt. The door hadn't opened, but she could feel it. Someone was still out there, watching, waiting. Panic surged through her. She couldn't stay here. She had to get out. Without thinking, she spun around and bolted for the door, her sneakers screeching against the tiled floor. She shoved it open with all her strength, nearly crashing into a group of students passing by. But she didn't stop. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she raced down the hallway, weaving through desks and lockers, ignoring the confused stares of her classmates. She needed to find someone who would listen, someone who could help. And then she saw him, Mr. Harris, the school janitor. He was pushing a mop down the hallway, completely unaware of the terror flooding through her. "Mr. Harris," she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with urgency. He looked up, his brows furrowing at the sight of the panicked girl running toward him. "Emma, what's wrong?" She glanced behind her, fear flickering in her wide eyes. "It's the principal," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You have to help me. Please." Mr. Harris' expression darkened. He had worked in this school long enough to know when something was seriously wrong. And right now, the fear in Emma's eyes told him everything he needed to know. He straightened up, his grip tightening around the mop handle. "Tell me everything." But before she could say another word, a shadow loomed at the end of the hallway. And just like that, Emma knew he was coming for her. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she saw the figure at the end of the hallway. The principal. His sharp eyes scanned the corridor, his expression unreadable. He wasn't running after her, but there was something in the way he stood, calm, calculating, that sent chills down her spine. Mr. Harris noticed her panic and subtly stepped in front of her, blocking her from view. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "Emma, start from the beginning. What happened?" Her hands were shaking. She didn't even know how to put it into words. She glanced around, afraid someone might be listening. She could feel the walls closing in on her, the weight of what she knew pressing down on her chest. Mr. Harris leaned in slightly. "You're safe. Just tell me." Emma swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was in the bathroom. I was about to leave when I heard someone come in. I thought I was alone, but then I heard." She stopped, her throat tightening. "I heard voices. Someone was upset. And then I saw." A door slammed in the distance, making her flinch. Mr. Harris noticed. He put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Take a deep breath." Emma squeezed her eyes shut for a second, then forced herself to speak. The principal. He was in there, and he was talking to a student. No, not talking, threatening. Her stomach twisted just thinking about it. I didn't see who it was, but I could hear them. They were scared, begging him to stop. Mr. Harris' jaw tightened. He had been working at the school for years, long enough to see things that didn't sit right, but nothing like this. "Did he see you?" he'd asked. Emma shook her head. "I don't think so. I barely got out in time." Mr. Harris exhaled slowly, thinking. He wasn't just the janitor. He had been at this school long before the current principal took over. He had seen changes, shifts in power. He had always kept to himself, but this was different. The principal was getting closer now, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. He was looking around, scanning, searching. "We need to move," Mr. Harris said under his breath. Now. Emma's legs felt weak, but she followed him. They ducked into a supply closet just as the principal turned the corner. The door clicked shut behind them, and Emma could barely breathe. The small space was packed with cleaning supplies, the scent of bleach strong in the air. Mr. Harris stood still, listening. Through the narrow gap under the door, Emma could see the principal's shadow stretch across the floor. For a moment, everything was silent. Then his voice, calm, steady. "Emma." Her heart stopped. Mr. Harris tensed beside her, holding his breath. "I know you're here," the principal continued. "Come on out. Let's talk." Emma squeezed her hands into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't trust him, not after what she had just heard. Mr. Harris leaned in close and whispered, "Stay quiet." Outside, the principal's footsteps echoed as he slowly walked past the closet. He paused for a long moment. Then, finally, he kept moving. They waited until his footsteps faded into the distance before Mr. Harris let out a quiet breath. "We can't stay here," he said. "We need proof." Emma looked at him, confused. "What? If what you're saying is true, we need to catch him. Otherwise, no one will believe us." Emma's stomach churned. The last thing she wanted was to go back, but she knew he was right. And deep down she knew the only way out of this was through. Emma's pulse pounded in her ears. The idea of going back, of stepping anywhere near that bathroom again, made her chest tighten. But Mr. Harris was right. No one would believe her without proof. She took a deep breath. "How do we get it?" Mr. Harris glanced down the hallway, making sure the coast was clear. "There are cameras," he said. "Not inside the bathrooms, but near the entrance. If we can get the footage, it might show who was in there with the principal." Emma felt a flicker of hope. "Where's the footage stored?" "The security office," Mr. Harris said. "But it's locked. Only the principal and the front office staff have access." Emma's stomach sank. "So, we're stuck." Mr. Harris hesitated, then shook his head. "Not necessarily." She watched as he pulled a set of keys from his pocket. Not just any keys, janitor keys. The kind that opened almost every door in the building. Emma's eyes widened. "You can get us in." Mr. Harris gave a small nod. "But we have to be careful. If we get caught, it won't just be detention." Emma swallowed hard. She knew what that meant. If the principal had already gone this far, there was no telling what he'd do to keep his secrets buried. They moved quickly, slipping through the empty hallway and ducking behind lockers whenever footsteps echoed nearby. The security office was at the far end of the building, near the main entrance. When they finally reached the door, Mr. Harris inserted the key and turned it carefully. The lock clicked open. Emma held her breath as they stepped inside. The room was small, lined with shelves of old tapes and a monitor displaying the live security feeds. Mr. Harris moved to the desk and started searching the computer. "Look for today's footage," Emma whispered, glancing nervously at the door. He scrolled through the files, clicking through the timestamps. Then suddenly he stopped. "Here," he said. Emma leaned in, her heart racing as the video played. The timestamp showed earlier that day. They watched as the principal walked into the bathroom. A few seconds later, another figure entered, a student, but the camera angle wasn't clear enough to show their face. Then the door swung open again, and a blur of movement rushed out. Emma. She felt a shiver go through her. That was her running in fear. Then something unexpected happened. The principal stepped out of the bathroom and looked around, making sure no one was watching. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled something out, a small object, barely visible on the screen. He looked down at it for a moment, then slipped it back into his jacket and walked away like nothing had happened. Emma's mind raced. What was that? Mr. Harris rewound the footage and zoomed in as much as possible. It was grainy, but they could make out the shape. A phone. Emma's breath caught. The student, they were recording him. Mr. Harris nodded, and he took their phone. Everything suddenly made sense. The principal wasn't just trying to scare someone, he was trying to cover up evidence. That phone had proof of whatever he had done in there. A noise in the hallway made Emma jump. Footsteps, heavy ones. Mr. Harris quickly closed the video. "We need to go," he whispered. Emma's heart pounded as they slipped out of the room, locking it behind them. Just as they turned the corner, she spotted him. The principal. He was heading toward the security office. Mr. Harris gently grabbed Emma's arm and led her in the opposite direction. "We can't let him know we were in there," he whispered. "But now we know, he's hiding something." Emma felt a new determination rise in her. The principal had taken that student's phone because it had the truth. If they could figure out who it belonged to, they could expose everything. The next day, Emma watched closely as students moved through the hallways. She paid attention to the ones who seemed on edge, who avoided eye contact, who flinched whenever the principal walked by. And then she saw it. A girl sitting alone at lunch, staring down at her hands, her expression tense. Emma walked over and sat down beside her. "Hey," she said softly, "I think I know what happened." The girl's head snapped up, fear in her eyes. "What?" Emma glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Your phone," she whispered. "The principal took it, didn't he?" The girl's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "He said if I told anyone, I'd regret it." Emma reached out and squeezed her hand. "You're not alone. We're going to stop him." That afternoon, with Mr. Harris' help, they went to the school board with the security footage and the girl's statement. Everything unraveled from there. The missing phone was found in the principal's office, and when it was unlocked, the truth came out. By the end of the week, the principal was gone. As Emma walked through the hallways, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Relief. Justice had been served, and for the first time, the school felt safe again. She looked over at Mr. Harris, who gave her a small nod. She smiled back. Sometimes, the people who clean up the mess aren't just janitors. Sometimes, they're the ones who make things right.